All right, so the first problem statement we'll talk about is object localization. One of the simplest ways that we can think about object localization is as a kind of regression problem. So let's take a conventional image classifier like the ones we talked about in the preceding lectures. And what we can do is we can simply take its convolutional layers and we can add another set of fully connected layers after them, whose job is to output not the semantic category, but just the x, y, w, and h coordinates for the bounding box. And there are a variety of ways to train this. You could imagine training this just jointly, literally compute a loss function that is a categorical loss for the cat and some kind of regression loss for the x, y, w, and h, and backpropagate both losses into this network. So you would use a cross-entropy loss for the class label and some kind of regression loss like a Gaussian log likelihood or mean squared error for the bounding box location. There's actually a little bit of nuance in how to set up these kind of multitask objectives properly, and I won't have time to get into it in this lecture, but if you want to learn more about it, do check out some of the papers that I'll reference, especially the YOLO paper that I'll talk about later is a good example of this. You can read about the kind of loss functions that are used and make sure that you get your thing to work by using those ideas. But for the purpose of kind of understanding how these techniques are set up, you can just imagine this, that Gaussian log likelihood or mean squared error loss that I described in the bias and variance lecture from before. There's also a little bit of a difference between different methods as to whether both of these heads, so these little fully connected layers are called heads, if these heads are trained together with the convolutional layers, or another commonly used setup is one where the classifier is trained just like in the previous lecture, then this new regression head is just trained on top of the convolutional layers of that classifier without actually changing those convolutional layers. So this is sometimes referred to as the difference between just training a new head on an existing conv stack or training both classification and regression together end to end. All right. And both are reasonable choices, and depending on which one you use depends on the particulars of how your system is set up. All right. Now, this is a very simple design. You can either train jointly, multitask, or train with classification first and then train a regression head. This kind of works. It works kind of okay. But by itself, usually this is not the approach that most really effective localization methods will use. And we'll discuss why in a second. So what I would say is that if you just want a quick and dirty object localization system, maybe for like your final project or something, it's not a bad place to start. But if you want the very best results, there are a lot of little details that are needed to get it right, and we'll talk about those next. All right. So an alternative approach that you could employ is instead of trying to train a separate head to actually predict the position of the bounding box, what you can do is employ something called a sliding window. You can think of it like this. Let's take the original image of the cat, and we can ask, what if we classify every patch in the image? So instead of just taking the whole image, we can crop out a little piece of the image and classify that to see if that's a cat. And we can basically take every possible crop, and the one for which our classifier predicts the highest probability of cat represents the bounding box of the cat. So we can take this little patch and we can run it through a classifier, and our classifier says, this is 0.21% probability of being a cat. Okay, so that's probably not the right bounding box. But we can take this patch and run it through the classifier, and maybe for that one we get 0.85 probability of cat. So maybe that's the right bounding box. Now, you might be wondering why the cat is awkwardly stretched like that. Remember that our classifier accommodates fixed size images. So whatever patch we crop out, we have to resize it to be the same size as what the classifier expects. And this might result in some awkward anisotropic scaling, so it might involve stretching the image or squishing it in different ways. And that's actually okay if you trained your classifier to handle that kind of squishing and stretching. So if you trained your classifier on different crops that are different aspect ratios, it can actually figure out that it's a cat even though it's been stretched out. So that's actually okay. All right, so now of course the question we have to ask next is which crops do we take? And we'll see in the next section when we talk about object detection that there are some actually fairly nuanced answers to that question. But for now, we'll actually just consider the really simple solution of taking all possible crops within some range. So here's how we can do that. We'll first think about different scales. So the largest scale is one where you take the whole image. So if you take the whole image, then the only crop available to you is the whole image, and that's one crop. Then you can scale up the image, and you can scale it up by different factors. I'm doing it by powers of 2, but in practice you would probably be more fine-grained than that. Maybe you scale it up by 20%, 50%, 75%, something like that. But let's say you scale it up by a power of 2, and now if you grab patches of the same size, now you can actually tile them over the image like this, right? So now you have, how many? You have 9 different bounding boxes at this scale. And again, in reality, you would tile much more finely. You might even offset it by 1 pixel increments. So you'd have many more bounding boxes than this at every scale. But just to make it easier to visualize, I'll say you have 9. Now you're also going to consider scaling with different aspect ratios. So again, if we're doing powers of 2, maybe I stretch out this image by a power of 2 vertically. And now I have multiple bounding boxes. Now these bounding boxes are rectangular. Imagine what they would look like in the original image. Do you think that in the original image these bounding boxes would be wide and short, or would they be tall and skinny? Wide and short, or tall and skinny? Well, imagine taking a rectangle in that rescaled image on the right and imagining which pixels that rectangle covers in the original image. It'll actually be a wide and short rectangle. So for example, the top rectangle would get just the head of the cat and the grass in the background. So if you stretch out the image vertically and you take equal size boxes in that stretched out image, they correspond to wide and short boxes in the original image. And similarly, you can stretch out the image the other way and tile it with bounding boxes and classify each one. And then you can scale up the image some more and tile that, and so on. So in practice, you would have many, many more scales and much finer tiling, maybe even as fine as every single pixel. And then what do you do once you have all these classifications? Well, you could just take the bounding box with the highest class probability. By the way, looking at the bounding box that I have on this slide, which one is the right one? Which box represents the correct bounding box around the cat? Well, it's actually this one, because here the image has been stretched horizontally, which means that the bounding box, when projected back into the original image, will be tall and skinny, which is the aspect ratio of the cat. More generally, you don't have to pick the point with the highest probability. There are more sophisticated techniques you could use that are sometimes referred to as non-maximal suppression. And we'll revisit these more when we talk about object detection. But for this localization problem, because you know that there's only one correct bounding box in the image, simply taking the max might be pretty good. The best performing methods typically do something a little smarter than this, but it's not a bad heuristic to just take the highest probability box. All right. Now let's discuss an actual practical approach in the literature that does localization essentially by combining these 2 principles. And this is based on a paper by Pierre Sermanet called Overfeed. Now you might ask, why do we want to combine these principles? We can output the continuous coordinates of a bounding box, or we can use a sliding window. Both seem like they're pretty good. Well, the reason you might want to combine them is because they actually compensate for each other's weaknesses. The sliding window approach is very simple and elegant, and it doesn't require predicting continuous coordinates. The problem is that it can be very expensive to cover every single pixel, and you might not get the bounding box quite right, unless you really go by 1 pixel offsets. So it can be very helpful, even if you have a sliding window, to output continuous coordinates for the box to essentially allow the classifier to patch up the box a little bit. So you might give it a window that contains the cat and says, yeah, it contains the cat, but it's like a little bit off. It's like a few pixels to the side. That way you also don't have to consider every possible scaling and every possible aspect ratio, because the ability of the model to fine-tune the precise coordinates of that bounding box can compensate for this a lot. If you want to consider literally all possible anisotropic scalings, there are very many of them, right? Because if your image is, let's say, 200 by 200 pixels, the number of possible groupings you could have is 200 by 200, because you can scale down by 1 pixel along each dimension. So that's very, very large. We'd like to consider fewer scalings and use these continuous coordinate outputs to fine-tune the bounding box a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to take different patches via the sliding window approach, and for each patch we'll output the probability that the cat is present in that patch and the coordinates of the bounding box relative to that patch. Okay? Now, if the patch happens to be centered right on the cat, maybe the coordinates will just cover the whole patch, and that's okay. But if they're a little bit off and we don't have just quite the right aspect ratio, they might patch it up a little bit. So essentially, the continuous valued outputs provide a little correction to the sliding window. The particular way in which the overfeed model is trained, and this is maybe a little antiquated at this point because this is from 7 years ago, but the particular way in which it's trained in the paper is to pre-train the network on just classification and then train a regression head on top of the classification features. And then you pass this model over different regions at different scales, and for each one you get a class and a bounding box location. Now at this point you could just take the window with the largest probability of the class. What the actual paper does is it actually combines predictions from different patches in kind of, you can think of it as almost like a weighted averaging style approach. But that's kind of a design decision. So the particular paper averages together the boxes from different windows, weighted by their probability roughly. It's a little more complex than that, but that's the basic idea. But you could also just take the patch with the highest probability. Okay, so here are some actual pictures from the paper illustrating what the sliding window plus bounding box regression actually looks like in practice. So what you're seeing at the top are different scales, and for each scale, the model is predicting just the class. So what you're seeing at the top is just the class. And the different windows are color-coded here. So you can see they're all kind of overlapping on each other. And they're color-coded so that yellow means bear and purple is some other class. So there are many different classes there. So just look at the yellow boxes. The yellow boxes are the ones labeled as bear. And you can see that for the larger scale, for the fourth image, the rightmost one, many of the boxes are not labeled as bear. Many of the ones on the left, where there's just water and no bear, are labeled with something else. I don't know what that something else is. Maybe it's salmon or maybe it's water or something. In the middle row, what they're showing is the predicted x, y, w, and h of the bounding box at each position and scale. So you can see, for example, that in the far left, the patches cover almost the whole image, but the bounding boxes are predicted much more tightly around the bear. So it's actually, the x, y, w, and h is actually fine-tuning that window quite a lot. Now, what you also see is that the bounding boxes don't entirely agree. So each window has a slightly different bounding box. Some of them are more correct than others, and some of them assign a higher probability to the bear than others. But once these bounding boxes are combined, then at the bottom, the final combined bounding box prediction actually gets the bear centered pretty well. And if you're wondering what that kind of heat map-like looking thing at the bottom corresponds to, that's just visualizing the probability of bear at every position in the image at every window, where colors that are more yellow correspond to higher probability of bear. And you can see that, especially at the larger scales, the highest probabilities do tend to be centered around windows that cover the bear pretty well. Okay, so that's object localization. We can regress to bounding box locations. We can also do sliding window, and we can combine the two. We can have a sliding window where for every position we output a bounding box and then combine them in some way. Now, one thing that you might be thinking about right now is that the sliding window approach is computationally pretty expensive. For example, if you have 36 windows, if you have 6 along each dimension, naively you would pay 36 times the computational cost. If you're doing something more like what the overfeed paper was actually doing, you might have hundreds of windows along the image and pay hundreds of times the cost. Fortunately, we can make this approach much cheaper by leveraging a special property of convolutional networks. To build up some intuition for this, let's go back to this 3x3 tiling for the cat. This looks a lot like a convolution, right? In a convolution, we were passing a filter over an image, and now we're sort of passing our entire convnet over the image. So maybe we can somehow reuse some calculation across windows, right? When those windows overlap a lot, maybe we don't have to recalculate the convolutional layer activations for every window from scratch. Maybe we can reuse the calculations we've had so far. So here's an idea that can help us think about this. Let's say that we have a convolutional network over a very large image, an image that is maybe double the size of the original one. So we compute our convolutional activations just like we did before. So these are here, let's say we're representing a two-layer convolutional network. And then we have our classifier at the end where we flatten the last convolutional map into a fully connected vector and then connect them up with just regular linear layers. Only now, we're not going to use the entire convolutional map, we'll just use the top left corner. So this is what we're doing, for example, if we're passing a window over this image that is half the size of the image, and we just want the top left corner to be evaluated. So that the top left red box. So that will allow us to classify whether the cat is present in the top left. And then, if we want to also classify the top middle, then we would put a little filter there. We would pull out a chunk of that activation map, flatten it, and pass it through some fully connected layers. And for the top right, we would pull out some chunk, flatten it, and pass it through those fully connected layers. And crucially, the chunks we pull out, they actually overlap, right? Because if you remember when I passed that filter, when I passed that classifier, not filter, classifier, over the top of the image, the actual region, the window I was pulling out, was half the size of the image, but I had 3 of those windows along the top. So each of them overlap by about 50%. Okay, so that's what we're actually doing. Now, one way to do it is to literally have a convnet that takes in half the size of the image. And then when we flatten the entire last convolutional layer. But as you can kind of see from this picture, you could also just take in the whole image, run all your convolutional layers on the whole image, and then at the end, when you want to classify, you just pull out a chunk of the last convolutional map. But actually, if we look at this, we can recognize that these classifiers, the fully connected bits, are themselves just convolutional layers. And they can be implemented as such. So we don't need to actually write any special code to do this. We can actually implement the classification layers, those fully connected layers, as a convolution, and simultaneously, via forward pass in this new kind of convolutional classifier, get a probability of cat for every one of those windows. In this case, there are 9 windows, and we would get 9 outputs. Each output corresponding to a probability for every class. How do we implement this? Well, before we had 2 fully connected layers after our convolutions. Each of them had 4,096 units. But we want to evaluate those convolutional layers at every position. Those fully connected layers at every position. That is basically a convolution. It's just a 1-by-1 convolution. So each of those fully connected layers only takes as input the previous fully connected layer, except for the first one. The first one takes in an entire patch of that convolutional response map, but the one after that takes in just the output of the previous one. So that's actually a 1-by-1 convolutional layer with 4,096 filters. 1-by-1 just means that it only accesses the previous location. So if you're classifying the top left, first you have to flatten that entire chunk of response map. That becomes your first fully connected layer. And the second fully connected layer only looks at the output of the first one, so it doesn't peek at its neighbors. And that's exactly what you get with a 1-by-1 convolution. So specifically, to make this very precise, the first operation, the flattening, which goes into the first fully connected layer, that now becomes a regular convolution with a pretty large stride. The next fully connected layer is a 1-by-1 convolution with a stride of 1. And then the last layer, the softmax layer, is also a 1-by-1 convolution with a stride of 1. So if you're not certain about how this works, I would encourage you to try to draw this out on a piece of paper draw what it looks like to have a separate classifier at each of those 9 positions, and then think about how you could encode that with convolutions. Now, the resulting network would be entirely convolutional, would have no fully connected layers at all, and its output would actually be, in this case, 3 by 3 by, let's say, 1,000 if you have 1,000 different classes. All right, so that's actually basically what the overfeed paper does, except in their case, the input to each position is much larger. So what they're illustrating here is how if you have a 14 by 14 input to your convnet, and that outputs one class, you can turn that into a convnet that takes in a 16 by 16 input, and then outputs a 2 by 2 output for the probability of the class in the top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. Now here there's a lot more overlap than in my little simplistic diagram, but the idea is exactly the same, that you just turn those non-convolutional, fully connected layers at the top into 1 by 1 convolutions. And that allows you to produce a class label at every position. This is a very important idea that we're going to see come up again and again when we talk about detection and segmentation. The idea that a convolutional network can produce predictions at different positions in the image while reusing the activations in the convolutional layers. Okay, so this kind of calculation reuse is very powerful for localization problems with convnets, and we'll see variants of it crop up in the other sections as well. All right, so to summarize, the building block for our localization system is a convnet that outputs a class and a bounding box coordinate. We can evaluate this network at multiple scales and for many different crops, each one producing a probability and a bounding box. And we can implement the sliding window as just another convolution without having to recompute all the activations at every single position by using these 1 by 1 convolutions.